Hey UX community. Last time we left off saying that we would probably do buttons, which I believe will be a good introduction to auto layout and components. So let's jump right in and do that. We'll go ahead and just duplicate one of these pages, any page, whichever one seems easiest to you. Oops. Go ahead and just get rid of this grid stuff here. Change the name of this to buttons. And we'll go ahead and start simply here on a new page. You know, like I said before, if you were creating a design system, you'd probably want to keep, you know, certain elements. I mean, you may not want a page per element like we're doing here, but, you know, you might want some kind of a logical grouping of items. So I'm just trying to kind of build this out in such a way that we're sort of sticking with that basic principle here. So now that we've created all of these styles, so if you click on your outside of any of your artboards here, you'll see all the styles that we've created in the last couple of videos. So I went ahead and cleaned this up a little bit and made a couple of extra ones just for the continuation of these videos, other things I thought I might need, but you know, to save you the pain of watching me create each and every one. So I'm going to go ahead and just say we're going to use an H2 for these buttons. Go ahead and select the text tool. We'll just type out a label. We'll call it button. Now, anytime I create components, I've really kind of, in a lot of cases, I don't really use shapes anymore. I primarily use frames unless there's a specific reason I can't use a frame. You know, if it doesn't start out with a relatively, you know, square or rectangular shape. You know, if I need a triangle for something, then of course I'm going to use a shape because you can't really turn a frame into a triangle. So, you know, in those instances, I'll use shapes. But for the most part, I don't really use shapes. Anytime I'm usually using a square or a rectangle, I will use a frame. And the reason for that is, for one, we're going to be using auto layout, and auto layout automatically creates a frame for you. But for two, frames also give you a few little sort of finer detailed things that shapes don't. It gives you a little bit finer level of control. But for the sake of this, for creating this button, we're just going to select this text label that we put here called button, and then we're just going to hit Shift A, which is auto layout. That's going to automatically create a frame for us. So if you look over here in your layers, on the button page, you're going to see that it actually created a frame. And these little icon indicators here are your auto layout indicators. Let's go ahead and just ungroup this just to show you. So if we ungroup this right now, you'll see that it just removed it because we did it with auto layout. So it just removes it when you ungroup it. But let's go ahead and just say, if you right click on this, let's go ahead and start from scratch, but just frame this selection. And so I can kind of show you what I'm talking about here. So we'll frame selection. Now we've got a frame here. Frame 1, so we'll just name this button because that's going to be our main component. And then we'll go ahead and we'll add an auto layout, and you'll see because we've already added a frame in here, you'll see what I mean. This is the standard frame icon. And then if we click Shift A, it will add an auto layout. Now what this icon is telling us is it's telling us which direction the auto layout is flowing in. So auto layout can be quite confusing for folks, and you'll see how it can get quite confusing when we start getting into really complex layouts with it, like when you start doing full page layouts with it or really complex components. It can get, it can get hard to follow. And what's great is that Figma has included this sort of, this icon language over here to tell you what's happening, which really helps guide you when you start getting into some really complex embedded auto layouts, this is very helpful. So you'll see if we go over here to the auto layout palette over here, you'll see if we change this arrow to down, you'll see that icon changes to show that that auto layout is flowing in a downward fashion. So we're going to change this auto layout back to horizontal for the sake of the button. And then we'll go ahead and we'll leave this set to hug. And I'll explain that in just a second as well. But now we have an auto layout button, and the reason I don't really use shapes anymore is because if I want to fill this a color for a button, if I want to put this button, put a color into this button, for example, I can just fill this frame with that color. I don't need to put a shape for the color under there. So if we go down here to the fill area, let's choose one of our primary colors for the button fill. And now you'll see that we have, a button here, which it has its fill. Now we can go over to the auto layout section over here where our auto layout properties are, and we can start to put some definition around that. So, we could say, okay, how much spacing or padding do we want on the side? Maybe we want 16 padding on the sides, and maybe we only want 8 on the top and bottom, because we already have some padding built into it via the text style that we have selected here. So there's already a little bit of padding built in via that text style. So now you'll see what we've done here is now we've got this button created, and it's because we set up these hug properties, there's a few different settings here. You can say fixed width, you can do a few different things, and when you start embedding these, you get some additional options. But for the sake of doing this button, the reason we selected the hug property here, why we're telling it to hug, is because when we're done creating this button component, your team will be able to pull an instance out on stage, and they will be able to change the label to whatever they want. And you'll see that the button then is responsive, essentially. So that's why we're choosing the hug on the button, is to give it that responsive behavior, so that when your team goes and selects that, so when your team goes in and starts using this, that button will flex appropriately based on our settings here. So we'll go ahead and just align this. I've been aligning everything kind of starting 40 pixels down on the 8 pixel grid, vertical grid. So again, just get used to thinking about your alignment of things, get used to using that grid structure. And the more you get used to that, the more it becomes second nature, and the better base that you'll have for any design that you do, if you're always thinking about the grid and always making sure that you're using styles, and always, you just kind of want to get used to utilizing all these details and all these things that you're putting this effort into. So now, again, I'm trying not to use too many shortcuts here. I'm kind of trying to show you guys where things are at in the menus, just in case. Shortcuts will come over time. If you just want to know where things are at, where things are located, if someone teaches you via shortcut, then you may not know what menus things live in. And if you need to find, and it's okay to explore these menus and get to know the menus. You don't have to do everything with shortcuts right away, in my opinion. Shortcuts will come from usage, and especially here in Figma, they've got the shortcut right here next to it. So every time you use this, you can take a peek at that, and eventually you'll get used to what the shortcut is, and you'll just naturally start using them. So we're going to create a component out of this button. And I'm going to show you a few different ways that you can go about creating buttons. And actually, for the time being, let's just take this button out of here, because we're going to do a few things. So let's just remove this button from the page layout altogether, because you'll see why we're doing that in just a moment. If you wanted this layout to be your public-facing version of your design system, for example, you might not want your components in there, and I'll show you why. Because when we start creating variants, it blows out the way that these buttons start to look when you put variants in here. Now, there's several different ways to do things inside of a component as well. Figma has recently released what's referred to as properties. So you've got variants and you have properties, and properties do some pretty cool things, and they make things easier on your end user. So for your team, for example, that's using your component library. However, there are some limitations to the way that properties work that you need to be aware of. I still kind of prefer components in a lot of ways, and for the main reason being that components still give you a very visual view into all of the different things that you're doing. So let's go ahead, and for the sake of this, we're going to start creating some variants. So now we have our main sort of button component, and you want to come up here and just click the variant icon here. So we'll add a variant. And you're going to want to do, whenever you're creating a button, obviously you're going to have, you're going to have several different states. You're going to have different things you might want to do depending on what kind of a component it is. For something simple like a button component, we're probably just going to have a few different states. Let's go ahead and click this one more time, and let's get 3 in here. Let's say we're going to do a button default state, a hover state, and then maybe an on state or something. Or we might want to do, some other variations of the button too. Like you might want to do a regular button, and then you might want to do an alternate button style or something like that. So we'll show you how to do all that. But you will see that every time you create a button variant, over here you get this current variant, you get property, and whatever that property value is. So we've got a property of 1 here and a default value. If we select the second one, we got a property 1 and a variant 2, property 1 and a variant 3. You can construct your variants in this manner quite easily. Let's say that you wanted to create an alternate version of this. You could create a few more of these, and we could restyle these to be our alternates. And then you could go in and you could say, okay, this is going to be my second button, so I might want to change what this is. This might be, property 2 or whatever, variant 1, property 2, variant 3, etc. for the alternate style button. So you could do it all like that, constructing it using this menu over here. And Figma is very good about allowing you to do things in batches or to do group selections and group changes. So we could select this and we could say, okay, this is going to be button alternate or something, and then you could have the same setup here where you could say, okay, the first one's going to be my default, so I've got 2 defaults now. And then, I would want to go in and probably change this though to be regular button or something like that. Anyway, you could construct this entire thing over there, but I'm going to show you a different way that I think is better, and I'll explain why I like doing it this other way. So the other thing you can do that's I think is much faster and simpler to understand, especially in the beginning when you're first starting to create components, is that over here, if you look at your layer panel, if we were to double click into this, you'll see that Figma sets things up based on a key value pair. And so Figma is saying, okay, I've got a key value pair anytime I want to set up some kind of a property. And so all you need to know is that Figma expects some key equal signs and then the value of that key. So we could string those together. So let's say we want to do that with our button here. Let's say we want to do our default button. So we might say let's say we want our default button or whatever, our primary button. So we could say type. So button type equals primary, and then put a comma. So you want to do these key value pairs separated by commas, comma delimited. So we could say type of button is primary, and we want to say the state of this button is going to be our default state. So we could say default, if I could just type. I still can't type. And then you could add however many properties you want. So let's just throw in, let's say we want a version of this button with an icon and a version without. So we'll go ahead and we'll add that property in here right now. We'll say icon equals, and let's give this a value of true this time. And we're going to set this up as a Boolean, and I'll show you why we want to do that. So we're going to say type primary, state default, icon true. Or well, here, let's say false because we haven't put the icon in yet. So this first one will be without the icon. So now what you can do is you can just double click into that again, hit copy, and then the second variant is going to be almost the same, right? It's still going to be our primary button type. The state, however, we're going to want to call that hover, and we'll still say icon false. Then the second one, let's say that's all going to be basically the same again, type primary, but this one's going to be state. Let's say it's an on state. And then icon will be false again. So now we have these set up. Now we could go in and style these each individually, uniquely, however we want. So, you know, let's say our hover state is going to be some other kind of blue or something. We could set up another style. Let's say it'll be a darker shade of blue, and then we can set that up as a style to make sure that we can reuse and repurpose that easily. So we'll say button on state. Sorry, I'm going to step away for just a second here. Here. She wants to say hi to everybody, so here, we'll say hi. Sorry, she'll start talking way too much and disrupt this entire situation. So Kitty got to say hi. We'll put her out until we're done here and then let her back in. So in this particular case, if we're going to say this is an on state, I don't know what we might want the on state to be. I mean, maybe it's the on state's a totally different color. Let's make sure that we finished that button on state. And then I can see here when I'm selecting this, I can see that we have some undefined colors in here. So let's just select all of those. I like to try to make sure that all of my colors remain defined. Even the white on the buttons, I want to make sure those are defined as well. Just so that way, if I ever want to go in and change one of these colors, it will propagate throughout the entire, through the entire design system, and it will be an easy swap. So let's say our on state was some other color. I don't know. Let's say it was one of these dark colors or something like that, just for the sake of getting through this. Now what we want to do is we want to create our icon variant. So we want to create the icon true variant. And so I would just duplicate these and then just make sure they're kind of grouped. It just makes it easier to roll through them in this way. So, and then what you're going to notice now is if we select this, we're going to see some errors over here. So we're going to see some variants have same property values, and that's because we just duplicated those, and so those still have the same property values on them. So what we want to do, here's another cool trick I'll share with you guys really quick. We already know we want to change all of these from icon true to icon, or from icon false to icon true. So if you select all of these, just do a shift select on all of these, do a right click and say rename. Now we can go in here and we can say match optional. So we can say match false, and we want to change any match of false to true. Rename. And now we've renamed that property on all three of these layers that we had selected. That's a really cool feature that I just recently learned, and would have saved me so much time in Figma if I had known that earlier. You can also do a similar thing over here by just selecting all of these things together, selecting all of these variants, and then just typing in whatever your new value is here. So you could say false, and we could change them all to false, or we could have changed them all to true that way as well. So there's, much like any other application, there's more than one way to do something. Now for the sake of doing this notion of an icon version, we'll just go ahead and select the shape tool, and in this particular case, let's say, well, here, let's just keep it something simple and easy. We'll just do like a little circle icon for whatever reason. You want to do a circle icon. We'll remove the fill. We'll put a stroke on this. Let's say we want a stroke of, I don't know, 3 or something that looks like it's a similar weight to the text, because you might want the weight of that to feel natural next to your text. And then we'll just change the width of this. If we want to match to our 8-pixel grid, we'll say 24, just to make sure that that's kind of adhering to our 8-pixel grid. And then if we right-click this, we can say frame selection. Or we could just change this into a component as it stands. But, what I like to do typically is frame my selection, and so that it gives me the ability to do some alignment things inside of that frame if I want to. I mean, in this particular instance, it's just a dummy icon for the sake of this tutorial, so we don't necessarily need to worry about that, but we could go in there and say frame selection, and if for whatever reason, this frame were bigger, for example, then the icon itself, like let's say the frame was 32 by 32 or something like that, right? Then we could add an auto layout to this frame just like we did to the button, and we could go in here and start to, well, first of all, we'd have to make sure that we didn't allow it to switch itself over to hug, but again, let's change that back to 32 since we had hug selected. So now you can see if we had a frame of 32 by 32, but the internal element was 24 by 24, by adding it inside of this frame, we could put an auto layout on there. And then we could start to play around with the alignment if we wanted to. So you could go over here to your auto layout settings, and you could start to align this element inside of this frame. In this particular instance, we're going to go ahead and just leave it centered. And we're just going to go ahead and leave it set to the same width and height as the icon because, why not? We don't need to align that icon inside the frame. I just wanted to show you guys that in case when we get into more advanced things, you'll see where that'll come in handy. But now we'll just change this name to, we'll just call this icon, circle, whatever you want to name it. And then we'll turn this into a component as well. And the reason I like to do this is because I like to try to take sort of a atomic approach to everything. So if I have something like an icon where I know I'm probably going to be reusing that, just because I'm making it specifically for the button doesn't mean that I'm probably not going to reuse that elsewhere as we start to get further and further into the design system. So because I want this to be a reusable element, I try to, like I said, think real atomically, right? Like I want this will probably be reused elsewhere for other things. So let's go ahead and make it its own component before we add it into the button. But then we can go in and we can add it into the button, and we can add it into all these sort of different states. Now, when we drop that in here, you'll see it didn't quite align right. So that just means that when we created this first button, we weren't necessarily thinking about how the icon would align. So we didn't set up the alignment value here to account for two elements that might be possibly sort of different sizes. So all you have to do is go in here and select all of these, and then we'll go over here and we'll find the auto layout panel. And then you just want to change this to have it center vertically. So if you just change that to center, now it will center with the text inside of there. Now, in this particular case, this particular icon doesn't really, because it's a circle, it doesn't really lend itself to sort of uncentering this button optically, but sometimes icons will. Like if this was a triangle or something else, the fact that we have equal spacing on either side of this might start to feel sort of optically off. Like it might start to feel, it feels a little weighted to the right. When you put an icon next to text and a button, it tends to feel weighted towards text side of things a little bit. And you might want to optically center that by coming over here and saying, okay, I'm going to look at these properties in my auto layout again, and I might want to break these properties out into their individual values here, and then start to go, okay, I might want to change that to 8 on the left side to sort of optically center this. So we could do that, since all of these have all the same values, we could do that all together at one time. Just change that to 8. And that's starting to look a little too far the other direction now. So, you know, maybe we just change this to 24 and change this other one to 16, and then that will solve it by adding a little bit of additional space over here. Now, why this is important is because I want to show you an example of why I like doing variants over using some of the new properties values that you can use in Figma for creating buttons. Because what we could have done is let's just take this out. Let's just take a copy of this out for a second. And so let's go ahead and just detach the instance here. So this just gets us back to all of our raw basic parts. So if we had created this, let's say this is button P for property, because Figma recently introduced this notion of properties, and properties give you some interesting things. So let's say we had a component here that this was another button component, and we wanted to build this in a different way instead of using variants like we're doing here. You could do this just as easily here using a property. So if we go into here, select this icon, for example, and we go down here, you'll start to see these property value icons appear. So you'll see down here in layer, there's a Boolean property available to us through the layer menu. There's also a what's called instance swap property here, which would allow us to swap that icon out for other icons in our library easily. And you might want to use both of these if you were creating a button that you wanted to be very flexible for your team. But I like to use a mix of variants and properties, because you could do it all here using properties, but here's the problem when you get into doing that. Like, let's say we went in here and let's say we created this Boolean and we said show icon circle equals, show icon, and let's say we wanted to make that just show icon equals true, create property. So now if someone grabs an instance of this out of your library, they now have this show icon property available to them, and they can easily turn that icon off or on. Now the problem with doing it this way is if you want equal spacing on either side of this button, for example, if the icon making the button feel weighted to the right didn't bother you and you didn't want to have this offset padding value, then this would be an easy way to create a button with an icon that can be turned off or on. That's a very simple way of doing it, and it works just as well, except that now if your team turns the icon off, then they're going to have to go in and they're going to have to change one of these property values on an override. It's going to be more work for them if you've done like an offset padding like this. So that's just something to be aware of. That's why I don't like to use properties for just, a Boolean value for just turning an icon off in a button, for example. I mean, this isn't the best example because this is a really uniform icon that, if we want to even call it that, this is a really sort of uniform scenario, whereas other icons with other odd shapes would lend themselves even further into the realm of needing this padding to make them feel balanced. But over here, then you've got a real problem when people start duplicating things that way. So let's just go ahead and kill those, and we'll stick with the variant version of this for the time being, and I'll show you how to mix variants and properties to kind of get the best of both worlds. So another place that you can add a property in here is text, for example. So if we go in and we select this text, we can go down here and you can see that there's a content window here now that we have the text selected, and there is a value of button. So we can also select this to create a text property. And if we do that, then we could say button label. And we're going to leave the value at button because the team can change that to whatever they want. So we'll create that as a property. And then you'll have to do that to all of these. So you can go in and, like I said, Figma, don't forget, Figma is very good about allowing you to do things in batches and to do things in groupings like this. So I would just go through and select all these, or we could have set up that property before we started duplicating these, and then the property would have been duplicated along with them. But I just want you to know that, as always, there's always like more than one way to get the same result. So if you multi-select all of these elements and then click this, you can see our button label property's already been set up. So all we have to do is select that from the drop down, and now every version of this now has that as a property. So now if someone grabs an instance and pulls that instance out on stage, now they can say change button label. They can change it to whatever they want, and it's easy. They could have done the same thing with an override, but this just makes it easier for them. They don't have to click in. And once again, the button is not the best example of where this adds value, because a button is such a simple component that to double click in and to change this on override back to whatever you want, I mean, that's not that much work, right? But when you start getting in to this atomic approach where you start embedding components inside of other components, and you've got a bunch of little atoms all pieced together to create a more complex component, then you start getting into where this starts to really add value. So they don't have to click in and click in again and then click in again and then create an override. And, so it makes it much easier on the users of your design system if you set these properties up so that they can access that right here and do it without double clicking their way through some crazy folder structure or whatever. So just trust me, when we get into more advanced components, you'll start to really see the value of this. So now that we've set this up, like I said, with variants, also that variant is now available to them where they can just select icon, because we set up those, remember we set up those Boolean values over here, the true and the false over here. So now all they have to do is those Boolean values tell Figma that it needs to just go ahead and show one of these toggle switches. So now your team can just toggle switch that icon off or on, and then once they have the icon on, if they wanted to change this icon to a different icon in the library, they could come in and select some other component, some other icon component to swap it out with. It gives you a lot of power to be able to do quite a lot as we get in there. So also we've been introduced now to auto layout with buttons. So we've got this kind of, this small introduction to auto layout where we see that we can add padding and spacing, and we can align things inside of frames and all that kind of stuff. So we'll get into much more advanced versions of that. I didn't want to introduce that to you guys too early on. For example, when I went over here and I created this grid and you guys watched me create that from scratch, duplicating all these little stripes, I could have built that really quickly and easily using auto layout, and I can probably even show you guys how to do that in a future video. Maybe we'll get into some more advanced auto layout features, but auto layout is very, very powerful, and it's a little confusing to folks at first. But again, all you really need to know about auto layout is it's basically just a stack of anything. You can add padding and spacing and that kind of stuff too, but it's basically just stacking things. It's stacking things either vertically or horizontally. And I think in Adobe XD, for example, I think this same feature is actually called stacks, because it just stacks elements. And it can add spacing and padding and that kind of stuff into a frame as well, which is all we've done with it in the case of this button. But if we started to use auto layout at the page level, so let's take an instance of our button, and let's drag it out here and just show you a real quick example. So let's say I wanted to stack a bunch of buttons to create a navigation or something like that, right? I could take an instance of my button out here on the stage. I can do a Shift A, turns that into an auto layout, and then you'll see this little icon changes over here. And again, this just tells us whether we're stacking horizontally or vertically. And you'll see that it kind of defaults to this 10 all the way around thing. So oftentimes I will just zero that out right away. And then if I just hit duplicate, so I've got the button selected inside of the auto layout frame. So if I just hit Command D or duplicate, you'll see that it duplicates the button directly underneath it. And then if we change the auto layout from vertical to horizontal, you'll see the difference there. So auto layout's a very simple thing. It starts to get a little more complex when you start embedding auto layouts inside of other auto layouts. It starts to get kind of complex, but for the most part, the simplest version of it. And then you can start to space things out, and in our case, we're using an 8-point grid, so we might want to space those out by 16, and then it keeps all the spacing settings even if you change the direction of the auto layout. So it's really quite simple, in terms of basically how it works. Where it starts to get confusing for folks is when you start embedding auto layouts into other auto layouts. Like if you start using it to build page structures, which I do all the time, and we'll get into that. We'll do some advanced components where you'll get to see more advanced use of auto layouts for something like a table component, for example. That's a really good sort of example of a really complex auto layout where you'll be embedding these things inside of one another in order to build a table. But Figma makes it a little bit easier on us by way of showing this. Like if I can't remember if we talked about this earlier or not, but if we didn't, they have these little icons, so you can see this icon shows that I'm in a vertical auto layout. A normal frame icon looks like this one right above it. The button page is a normal frame. This is an auto layout frame, and it shows we're vertical. And then if we change this to horizontal, you'll see it changes to a horizontal stacking order. So Figma is really good about giving you a lot of information through their icon system and the layers. So if you start to sort of learn how to read those and follow those, that will become really valuable to you as we start to get into more advanced componentry and more advanced auto layouts. So I think we're going to go ahead and cut this one at that. I don't want these videos to get too long, like I've said before, so I don't want to just keep on going on, because auto layout can get, that's a lengthy subject matter. We could take up a good amount of time continuing to talk about auto layout. So we'll cover that in in a little bit more depth in a future video. But for the time being, let's just call this your introduction to components, variants, and auto layout to some degree. And I'll figure out what we're going to do in the next one to keep this moving forward. Maybe we'll start to get into some navigation structure. Maybe we'll build a navigation system or something to allow our users to get around in our design system if we were going to make this like a public facing design system, for example. So hopefully all this has been really useful and valuable to you, and I will see you guys on the next one. Cheers.